in the beginning that made everything, I mean, it made the answer, but I had the right idea, which is all happened.
And then the numbers that you calculate are so weird.
Yeah.
That it was like, I did it 3 times, that's why I was looking, I thought I was doing something wrong. This cannot be the number, what I remember is like a normal.
Is this still recording? You're gonna get you're having this conversation.
So I went to YouTube and
You're gonna have to put on your like stage makeup before you come to class.
never turned. Never looked at the camera.
Right, never
turned.
Okay, well now it's already can watch the video.
Yeah, that's definitely an argument advantage.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Percentage is great, that's the other thing. I worked on the morning, I was like, wait a minute, how much, why are they selling such a... Yeah, oh, I have problems.
Well, we also
Did you type it? But I have 15 of these and then the sheet, you know, the graph, whatever it was.
There'd be no guarantee you have to work here.
correct.
You gotta be Harvard. There'd be no guarantee. So I mean, yeah.
Well, honestly, I did the
That's
But they like, well,
Yeah,
yeah. Mine are not nearly as elegant, I just sort of am drawing.
yeah, go for it,
He said as long as it was legible, right, or, you know, good handwriting.
You've got the formulas to refer to, the steps to go through to solve for K, or, you know, to do the derivative. Without a cheat sheet, just on the,
Yeah, right.
they're generic formulas.
When you get to
And
this,
added later.
and it changes everything.
Mark, this should be,
Third one wasn't so bad.
No.
The final one.
oh my gosh, I keep done. Okay, that says paper.
How to solve everything in the middle is in the book? Yeah, but the shares, it's just like through shares.
Hey Neil, do you think the exam is going to take the whole 2 hours?
Yeah, for sure.
Yes, I can do that as well.
So I submitted it from the side, and I got 25.
Hi.
But this one was pointed.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you'll have the answers coming out at 8 p.m. today on the website, so you can check right away. And yeah, well, I need to talk to TA, but we can probably
This is not a
make
sign.
it easy.
That's
Make
more
up
of
it.
a
Oh, yeah.
That'll be part of it, yeah. Yeah. But there's other things too, so that's just one. All right. Before we get started, I doubt I will take 50 minutes, so end class early and get to the midterm review. Okay, so we've covered income inequality, but of course income inequality does not equal poverty, okay? Now, of course, poverty is a relative term. Now, we would look at the average person living in Zimbabwe might look at the typical impoverished American and yearn for that person's life. Okay, so poverty differs inside of specific countries based on unique national conditions. Now, that said, we have a certain notion of how to measure poverty, and we usually claim that there's some cutoff point in a society, some certain level of income that determines what percentage of that society lives in poverty, which is, of course, a poverty line. We focus mostly on consumption or income, which, of course, relates to absolute poverty, right? We're talking about consumption and income. But it's important to remember the poverty itself is multidimensional. It's much more than just consumption and income. There are relative deprivations in societies that aren't readily encompassed by basic income measures alone. Now, that said, we tend to assume a poverty line of about $1 a day. Based on, of course, the lowest per capita incomes being between about $270 a year to about $370 a year. That's $1 a day, right? The World Bank report that we came up with. Now, before we get to talking about the $1 a day poverty line, it's important to note some of these other factors that contribute to pestilence and just a difficulty of living, being poor, such as access to safe drinking water, availability of public services, health outcomes, energy outcomes. These are all components, okay? Now, most governments specify their own poverty lines. Some have something known as minimum consumption baskets. So that might be something like consuming $4 of goods a day or $1 a day, right? Your typical measure. But they also have things based on other metrics like food, i.e., ideal number of calories consumed a day. Now, in the United States, we assume that those people who live on $16 a day or less are impoverished. In developing countries, we assume $1 a day. Now, there's a good deal of debate about these various poverty lines. Your book talks about them. Just be aware that the $1 a day is just a kind of off the cuff. It's the most widely used measure, but it's by no means the most comprehensive. Okay, some people claim that $2 a day is a better measure because even if you're living at slightly more than $1 a day, like $1.20 a day, you're still living often in subsistence. Your quality of life is generally pretty poor. There's also a cultural relativism argument for why $1 a day isn't appropriate. We claim that who are we to assume that $2 a day is sufficient to satisfy the dignity of the global poor in developing countries, when we would consider $15 a day at least or more to be worthy of a dignified living in the advanced industrialized world. Okay, so there's that cultural relativism component of this as well. I'm not going to get into that specific argument. You might fall on certain sides of it, but be aware that that's part of the ongoing discussion about how we measure poverty. Okay? Now, we have two broad poverty measures.
Can I answer a question?
Yeah, please.
On the quiz, you asked our guests for how many people actually live on $1 a day.
Yeah.
I had no idea. Are you going to tell us the answer or something?
Well, you just exposed me. So what I was going to do is put it on your 1-point bonus question on your test, with the hope being that you saw the question, you wondered, you'd look it up, and then if your answer differed from your survey and was correct, you would have gotten the point. But I believe it's about $1 billion. It was about 1.2 billion in 2003 when your textbook was written. About 1 billion today, and most of that growth has come from East Asia and in Southeast Asia. But we'll come up with another bonus question, okay? Maybe have you derive.
You can take that one.
I have another question.
We like that one.
Bothered to look it up.
What's that, Jurgen?
You can keep the bonus question.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, I have another bonus question for you actually, Professor.
Oh, thank you.
It's just that I never bothered to look it up, but I know years ago when I started working at the bank, 10 years ago, the distribution of income was 20% of income was distributed among the 80% of world population, and 80% of income roughly was distributed among the 20% of population.
Okay.
Is this still how it is, or the things have changed in the meantime because of China and India?
I don't know.
Hopefully, possibly.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
Because Wolfenson used to talk a lot about that. He would
Really?
always open up 20%, 80%,
Yeah.
80%.
Rather than just give a BS off the cuff answer, I'll say I don't know and I'll find out. Okay.
I'll
But
look
yeah.
it up then.
Yeah, feel free. Sure. So anyway, the two poverty measures we like to use. The first is something known as the head count index. Which measures the ratio of the number of people below the poverty line as compared to total population. Now obviously, this calculation, it's a ratio of the number of people below the poverty line compared to the total population. Okay? Yeah, when?
And is this normally using the $1 a day
Right.
or national?
Absolutely. So usually it's $1 a day, okay? But each country reports their own headcount index, okay, based on their own internal poverty line. So there's, cross-country statistics are obviously difficult to compare, but that's what I was going to say. The poverty line aspect of this is obviously really important. If you pick a very rich poverty line of $30 a day, then the United States has a fairly large headcount index, right? Most PhD students would comprise the bulk of that. Okay. All right. Just kidding. Okay. So that's the headcount index, the ratio of people, number of people below poverty line to the total population, which is of course dependent on what our cutoff point is. The greater the cutoff line, the greater the headcount ratio. Okay. Okay, and we also have something known as the poverty gap. The poverty gap describes the severity of poverty. How many people fall below the poverty line, and how far are they from the poverty line? Okay? If our poverty line were $1 a day, and everybody below the poverty line made 99 cents a day, then poverty relatively wouldn't be that severe. Okay? So this, of course, takes into account distribution. Our poverty gap is calculated with the following formula. I'm going to write the terms on the board, and then we will discuss them. Okay. The poverty gap is measured. Everybody see that? Okay. Poverty gap is measured by taking the poverty line and subtracting from it MC. MC is mean consumption per capita of all individuals below the poverty line. I repeat, MC is the mean consumption per capita of all individuals below the poverty line. Okay? So you can think of this as a type of percentage, okay? This is how far away people are on average from the poverty line, okay? The lower MC is, right? Let's just make up some numbers. If the poverty line were $1 a day, okay, and mean consumption of people below the poverty line was 50 cents a day, then that would lead to a higher poverty gap than a mean consumption of 90 cents a day, right? You can think of this, the greater mean consumption is, the less distance people are from the poverty line. Does that make sense? Okay. And then, of course,
What's HI?
it's the headcount index.
Oh, okay.
So the way to think about it this way is that the poverty line, PL minus MC, this term right here, shows how far the average person is from the poverty line. And HI, the headcount index, weights this term by the total percentage of poor people in the population.
Can you repeat, please?
Yep. This term right here, PL minus MC, shows how far the average person is from the poverty line. Okay? The greater that number is, the further away the average person is from the poverty line. The worse distributed income is. Okay? The greater people have to travel to even hit the poverty line. Okay? HI weighs that particular term by the total percentage of poor people in the population. So if a country has a very, very low mean consumption and a very high headcount index, they will have a large poverty gap. Okay? To prove it to yourself, just make up some numbers and see. Okay? We might give you numbers and have you make up answers in a future learning celebration. Okay. Just maybe then. Yeah, maybe a bonus question. Okay, cool. So any questions on the poverty gap and the headcount index? Yeah,
I'm so
question?
sorry. Could you
Yeah.
repeat the HI again, please?
What the headcount index
I know
is?
it's headcount
Yeah,
index.
it's just the, so you have some poverty line, okay? So let's say we had a poverty line of $1 a day. And in our particular country, we had 20 million people who lived on $1 a day. Oh, less than $1 a day, okay? Less than the poverty line. And our total population were 100 million people. Okay? Total. So our headcount index would be 20%.
Ah, okay. Thanks.
Okay? The greater the headcount index, the more greater percentage of your population who lives in poverty. Okay? Which is, of course, fully dependent on the poverty line you pick. So that a couple times. Okay. Cool. Any questions on how we measure poverty? What are your thoughts on these? Are you convinced?
I mean, we have to measure it somehow.
Yeah.
It's pretty crude.
Mm-hmm. I think the important lesson from this particular lecture is income inequality, poverty. Each measure has strengths and weaknesses. You really just kind of have to look at a battery of them, right? Compare their Gini coefficient with their poverty gap, with their headcount index, and you'll get a better idea of the relative deprivation of capabilities and choices in a certain society. No measure on its own is perfect, though. Okay? Okay, cool. So that is how we measure poverty. Now, but we all agree that poverty is a bad thing, so we have 3 broad strategies and 3 articles we assign. Art Cray, who used to teach at SAIS, is pro-poor growth. He wrote that at the World Bank and the IMF. I think he has a joint appointment or something. Nancy Birdsall is Bootstraps, who is very close friends with SAIS's dean. And she also runs the Center for Global Development, in case any of you want to know. And, of course, the World Bank, which employs lots of SAIS grads. So really, this institution is responsible for combating poverty. Okay. So, the World Bank's World Development Report in 1990, right, where they came up with the $1 a day metric, has 3 broad elements of combating poverty. Okay? They claim that first, countries should promote market-oriented economic growth to combat poverty. Second, direct basic health and education services to the poor. And third, develop social safety nets. Now, promoting market-oriented economic growth, that is largely in line with the neoliberal Washington consensus. But also, market-oriented economic growth, i.e. based on the force of the market, not the government picking winners, is more likely, particularly in less developed countries, with large unskilled labor pools, to alleviate poverty. Why might that be the case? What is it about having large unskilled labor force that makes market reforms a possible tool of combating poverty?
Because this is usually an authoritarian regime, and the unskilled is usually uneducated, so they'll do usually whatever the government tells them.
Whatever the government tells them. Okay, but let's say we have some, let's say, what I'm trying to get at is, what's the biggest asset of the poor? Their time, i.e. their labor, right? What's that?
labor surplus.
Exactly, they're themselves, right? They're physical energy, right? They don't have land typically, they don't have large savings, they don't have property. What they do have is their ability to work. So typically, when countries open up to international trade, large industries that tend to develop tend to be low-skilled, labor-intensive ones, things like textiles, right? Those market reforms tend to combat economic growth because they raise the returns on labor. Labor being the biggest asset of the poor, thus greater market opportunities, greater demand for labor, greater return for labor, and less poverty. Make sense, John? No? Think about it this way. Most poor people, they don't have land, right? They don't have large savings. All they have is themselves to do work in factories, let's say. Okay? When countries open themselves up to trade, allow foreign competition, typically the competitive or comparative advantage of poor countries is in low-skilled industries, right? We have very little tradable low-skilled sectors in the United States anymore because wages are so much higher than abroad, okay? So typically, the return on labor, on low-skilled labor in less developed countries is high, okay? Because they have the cost advantage. So if you were to open up to trade, the return on labor would rise and poverty would be alleviated. Make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
No, I was just going to give an example that when Coca-Cola, for example, opened up in our country, the comparative wage of the local worker is going to be much less than versus the one that will be in the U.S. But the poverty line will probably change because a lot of people have no choice but to go and work for Coke. So once they go there, whether it's $5 a day or $6, it's adding up to their wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And that way the poverty gap reduces,
Mm-hmm.
correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Okay. Secondly, promoting basic health and education services to the poor. This is fairly self-explanatory. Okay, you can't work if you're not healthy. Moreover, the returns on primary education are typically higher than tertiary education in less developed countries. Okay, giving people basic literacy has a far higher return than usually training people in the arts, the government elite who may or may not get subsidized tertiary education. Okay. And when we get to the education lecture, we'll spend some more time on the relative returns of each type of education. And finally, developing social safety nets. This is important to remember about poverty in developing countries. Usually it's a transitory state. Okay? Very few people stay below the poverty line for their entire lives. Okay? Especially when we're using the dollar a day metric. Okay? Most tend to live a highly variable existence, where they might have a breadwinner in the family who can push the family above the poverty line, but if that particular breadwinner is stricken by disease, they fall below the poverty line again. So having some semblance of safety nets to cushion the natural ebb and flow of markets is important to alleviate poverty. Now, the United Nations Development Program criticized the World Bank approach, and they claimed that in addition to those three things, in order to combat poverty, we need to be concerned with both the structure and the quality of growth. This is the UNDP in response. They claim that all too often, I'll write these factors on the board. Growth is jobless, growth is ruthless, growth is voiceless, growth is rootless, and finally, it's futureless.
Sorry, whose criticisms were these?
The UNDP. Okay? So, jobless growth, this is just growth that you have a higher per capita income growth rate or higher aggregate growth rate, but it doesn't create any jobs, right? And is this something that only befalls less developed countries? No, right? In the United States today, our GDP growth rate is still largely in line with population growth. It's still positive. It was only negative for a couple quarters. And yet, we have 10% unemployment. Okay, so this whole idea of jobless growth it's not just a developing country thing. Okay? Ruthless growth. What do they mean by ruthless growth? Well, they mean that typically large-scale economic growth can exacerbate income inequality, which kind of nullifies the idea of rising tide lifting all ships, right? So not only are jobs not created, but income doesn't change either, right? The jobs that people have don't get any better, in other words, or sometimes might go away. Okay? Third, it's voiceless. This is really the political dimension of economic growth, okay? You can have economic growth and you can try to fight poverty, but at the end of the day, if you don't have the political institutions to complement that, it's very difficult for people to lift themselves up out of poverty because you need some semblance of complementary political institutions, like those of education, civic engagement, etc., to coordinate the needs of the poor with the capabilities of the government. Furthermore, they claim that economic growth can be rootless. What do they mean by this? Well, that economic growth can destroy native cultures. I'm sorry?
Indigenous people community.
Indigenous communities, etc.
Because you want to develop, industrialize, and then build normally and develop where they live.
Yeah. Just like the Na'vi and.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm sorry, is this ruthless or rootless?
This is rootless. Rootless refers to cultural degradation because of economic growth. Okay.
Thank you.
And I flippantly mentioned the movie Avatar as an example of this. And finally, you can have futureless growth, or growth that borrows from the future to capitalize on gains to today, leading to intergenerational theft. Yep. Futureless growth. So growth that borrows from the future to capitalize on gains today is a form of intergenerational theft. It's a fancy word. Why are you smiling? Do you think that's funny?
No, I'm just thinking.
Are you thinking about it? So this is, of course, not necessarily just a developing country phenomenon, right? In the United States, we had a very large housing bubble whose losses were socialized, and the gap to fill up that housing bubble was largely borne by government debt and printing money. Okay?
That's why I was smiling.
A lot of the economic growth that took place over the past 8 years, kind of, you could argue, was borrowed from the future. Okay? So again, this isn't necessarily a exclusively developing country phenomenon. But in general, as Art Cray notes, growth is good for the poor. And what Art Cray claims is that there are 3 potential sources of pro-poor growth. The first is high growth rate of average incomes. You have a high growth rate of average incomes, typically that helps the poor. Everybody read this paper, right, that we assigned? Okay, if you haven't looked at it yet, that's okay. Take a look at it this weekend because he has a large data set that he bases these on. Okay, these aren't just assertions. Okay, these are based on regressions. Okay. Not necessarily truth, but empirically determined to a degree.
Well, can you say that the high growth rate of what?
Average incomes tends to be good for the poor. Tends to reduce poverty. He also notes that there is a high sensitivity of poverty to growth in average incomes. And that there are several factors.
What does that mean, a high sensitivity to poverty?
Meaning that the greater the growth in average incomes, usually the faster poverty falls. And that's, of course, just the mean income. It says nothing about distribution, right? It's just the middle income, if that continues to grow, that tends to be very good for alleviating poverty. So in general, he claims that there's a poverty-reducing pattern of growth in relative incomes based on certain factors. Okay, I'm going to mention these. I'll explain them a bit. So the first is he finds positive correlations between institutional quality and openness to international trade in trying to fight poverty. The stronger institutions you have, and the more open you are to trade, typically the faster and better you can combat poverty. Interestingly, he finds a negative correlation between government consumption and poverty. The more the government spends, typically the greater poverty rates are. in a relatively weak correlation across all of these various country cases between relative productivity in agriculture, relative access to primary education, etc. In short, growth is pretty good at combating poverty, he claims. Now, he does mention the possibility of a type of economic growth that might not be very good. He calls this a mesorizing growth. Which is economic growth at the expense of the poor, i.e. the poor actually see their incomes fall during periods of high economic growth. That growth is actually anti-poor. Not even poor neutral, it's anti-poor. Okay?
Just give a scenario for when that might happen.
He talks about in places that, in low-income countries, that have a high return to the rich people's assets, things like natural resources, okay, land, typically natural resources, land, or just property, capital, etc. Growth can be very fast, but it can also leave behind entire segments of the population, right? And we see this phenomenon largely in sub-Saharan Africa, okay?
Before you go any further, can you recap the weak correlation between, was it agriculture, primary education, what were you saying there?
Yeah, there's a relatively weak correlation between relative productivity in agriculture and primary education. The main point of Cray is claiming, like, look, there's a lot of things that influence poverty, but growth is generally a pretty good one, except for this special case of mesorized growth, yeah? So take a look at his piece to flesh out that idea, but it's the idea that you can have economic growth, very fast-growing economies where all the wealth is actually concentrated at the top. Okay? And you actually see poor incomes fall. Okay. Any questions on Dr. Cray's pro-poor growth piece? Okay. Just skim it this weekend. It's kind of long, and you don't need to spend lots of time reading about how he justified doing his regressions, but at least read the introduction and conclusion to get an idea of what he was getting at. Okay. Now, finally, Nancy Birdsall talks about bootstraps, not band-aids. What does she mean by this? Well, she claims that most of the dominant policies adopted by the IFIs, the World Bank, the IMF, were focused on alleviating the symptoms of poverty. In reality, we would be better off trying to address the causes of poverty by offering bootstraps to the poor. The bootstraps, a metaphor, of course, relating to the idea that one can pull himself or herself up by his own bootstraps. Right? And Birdsall claims that there are two main ways of doing this. The first, investment in basic education and healthcare. Second, income transfers and social safety nets. The logic behind education and healthcare we'll get to in subsequent lectures. But income transfers and social safety nets, these are all designed to cushion the blow of poverty in that a certain semblance of poverty alleviation relies on higher incomes to start with. And that you could lead to a positive cycle of poverty alleviation with a one-time conditional cash transfer, let's say, to the poor, confiscated from the rich.
What is the income transfer? Conditional cash?
So it's usually just confiscatory, just taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor.
Oh,
Okay. So that's Birdsall's piece. So just give that a skim. Okay. Great. So yeah, question, Maya?
So it sounded like it's a little bit of a contrary to Cray. Yeah.
Yeah.
She's talking about some of the other what you would describe as weakly correlated.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. I think the what you really find is that the correlation between growth and poverty is pretty strong, or poverty reduction, but each case is so unique, in that there's Yeah, what I think the benefit in the cost of what Cray is doing is he takes a very large data set and he comes up with a pretty clean correlation, with a pretty high R squared on the regression. And a lot of the variance in the variables explained by the variables he picks. But he doesn't really drill down into the specific causes, he just finds correlations. What Birdsall says, if you actually look at poor countries and look at how the successful policy decisions made to alleviate poverty, right? Not just having growth incidentally, but actually deliberate policy decisions, these are some of the things you can do. So, yeah, you're right. And I think a lot of that difference stems from methodology. Cool. So that is that. We've ended with 20 minutes. I will say a bit about the test and then we'll make it the Evan Hume show, but are there any questions before we talk about that? No? Just to recap, because a couple of you guys came in late. The test consists of 15 multiple choice questions, 5 IDs, where we say a term like headcount index, and you say it is the ratio of the number of people below the poverty line relative to the total population. The headcount index is dependent on the poverty line that you pick, and therefore is somewhat arbitrary. That's a good example of.
So, like definitions.
I'm sorry?
Definitions of terms, and is that what it is?
It's kind of like a it's kind of like a definition, but there'll be more conceptual ideas, right? So you explain why it's relevant to international development. You know, talk about a limitation of a concept, its benefit. Okay, don't just state what it is. That'll get you, 4 out of 5 points, or 3 out of 5 points. But for those 5 out of 5 points, you just gotta hit it out of the park. Okay. Then we will have one longer problem that involves some degree of computation. It will be somewhat similar to the problem set, but it might veer into different subject matters as well. So any formula we put on the board, be aware of. Not just this one, I'm just pointing to it as an example of a formula. But look at different formulas like the Harrod-Domar growth formula, or things of that nature. Okay? If I put a formula on the board, especially if I did a numerical example, it's probably relevant. And there's of course no formula sheet. Okay? You have to memorize. There's only like a handful of them using that. And then there is an essay where you have to use parenthetical notation. And that's where all those extra readings, Cray, Birdsall, all the, even Easterly and Perkins, all those, mention them directly. So if you say that people follow incentives and that's why countries grow when they have good incentives, put in brackets next to it Easterly. Okay? What's so funny, Lisa?
Painful.
It's not that bad. You'll see. Let's say it's very broad. You can cite your textbook, Perkins. I mean.
But come on, everybody's talking basically about the same thing. That's why we I don't remember really who said what sentence anymore.
That's fine. What we're really saying is just don't write some essay off the cuff, completely undocumented, just like for vaguely what you remember on the discussions in class. Okay, that's not an optimum strategy. And so, as I cite, an example here, economic development is good, and we're citing the author Evan Hume there, hence his name in parentheses. And also, non-graphing, non-phone calculators are permitted. So feel free to bring one of those. You can buy one at CVS if you have any questions on that. I would suggest you review your class notes, review all readings that were assigned specifically on the syllabus, especially your main textbook, so with a wealth of information, be able to cite authors again. And all the random articles that I gave you, put on the website. Those are helpful to read just because they might be good illustrations of the theories that you learned in class, okay? You could say that China's economic growth, they might fall into the middle income trap, which is something unaddressed by the solo growth model because of XYZ reasons, and Martin Wolf wrote an article about this, and he cited their I-core as a reason for this. I'm just making that up, but that's an example, okay? The articles are there to be tools to illustrate how well you know the subject matter. You don't have to know them off the top of your head, but they might be helpful. Okay? Any other questions? Anything about the course? Anything about
The policy brief, it seems like there's a draft due next week.
Yeah, your syllabus says one day, but we're gonna kick that down the road. We're gonna give you the policy brief. It's a 1,000-word policy brief. That's your next short assignment. We'll give you the prompt next Thursday. Probably the following Thursday we'll need a draft. If you want to submit one, it's completely optional. And then I think the next Thursday will be due. Okay? So you'll have 2 weeks to work on it. 1,000 words, saying that. But for those of you who are a little worried about your writing, you can submit a draft. No harm, no foul. Any suggestions we give are completely permissible. Okay? And Evan is happy to sit down with you and go over your draft, as am I. Yep.
I think I asked this before, but the problem set would be useful for studying.
Sure. So the problem set answer key will be released at 8 p.m. on the dot. It is set to go, so you can access on the website tonight. And Evan and I will grade the problem set soon, and we'll have them for pickup probably Monday after you close the business. So if you want to grab them, I'll be in my office. I'll send you an email with all of this. But if you want to grab your problem set that's fully graded, you can on Monday. And you know, if you have, if for some reason you can't do it, we might be able to scan it and send it to you, but that's a distant second option. Highly prefer not to do that. If you exercise it, know that you'll be annoying your professor and TA, who will then be grading your midterm examination an hour later. So just, you know, but if need be, we can definitely do it, okay? Okay, cool. Best of luck on your midterm. You don't, it's not designed to trick you. There are some tricky questions. It's not graded on a strict curve. It's possible for all of you to get hundreds on it. It's also possible for some of you not to get 100 on it, but that's okay. So just understand that we'll take into account both the distribution and your absolute value in determining your relative score. Okay? Great. Okay, Evan, without further ado, there's something else you want me to announce, right? Something about, no? Am I making that up?
No, it was, I didn't know whose homework assignment that was, but they
Okay.
knew,
Okay.
who identified it.
We're all good? And if you need anything, send me an email this weekend. Happy to chat via email. If you have any questions, just let me know, okay? Thank you.
I guess they see how many questions
You good? Did you grab Why the relocation? Good luck. See you on Tuesday.
Okay, a couple discussion points or recommendations about the actual exam. I haven't seen it, it hasn't been written yet. I can only give you some recommendations off of when I took the class and knowing how Professor Shanai likes to design tests. With regard to the setup, it's not going to definitely be this setup in terms of multiple choice, IDs, long problem, essay, but effectively it's going to be like that. And the long problem will probably be a quantitative problem, probably something with the solo growth model. I don't know that, but given how much emphasis there was on that, on the homework, that's what I would guess if I were in your position. That was kind of the framework for the exam that I took when I was in the class. The IDs I expect to be pretty straightforward, not in the sense that it makes them super easy, but it'll be what is the Gini coefficient, and then you just explain what the Gini coefficient is. There's not, I don't think there's going to be any subtlety to that. The multiple choice questions will probably vary in difficulty, and that's probably where the hardest problems will be, ironically, because that's where you can get into a lot of the nuance without having it be worth a huge portion of the exam. So the intent is not to have like an extremely difficult essay problem that just breaks people. The essay will probably cover a big concept that you can cite different things from the readings on. It's going to be straightforward. The multiple choice questions, don't overlook those in terms of difficulty, but also bear in mind that they're not the bulk of the weight of the exam. So, you know, allocate your time appropriately, but if you have extra, if I were in your situation, I would go back and read the multiple choice questions carefully, because they, like you said, they won't be written to trick you, but it could be something that, you know, for example, speaks to the difference between per capita and per effective worker, and understanding that distinction. Like, I think that's difficult. You might think it's easy, but that's the kind of multiple choice question that would be a little bit more difficult than something that you're likely to get in an essay. All right. So when you go into the exam, that's how I would recommend you look at the different structure points of the exam. Additionally, as far as preparing and tying in the readings, what I did was I would make an Excel spreadsheet where I would have each article, and I would try and write 3 to 5 lines from about that article based on what I had read in there and highlighted. That made it a lot easier to study than trying to review a 25-page article, and that was actually something I could retain. And then if you can start to associate it with the certain authors, then like he's saying, when you cite something, you can cite a specific article without having to try and draw on the entire thing. So if you try and go back, and I'm not saying just read the executive summary, because I think for the executive summary to make sense, you really have to have read the bulk of the article. But if you kind of go back and read through the executive summary and the conclusion, it'll kind of guide you to the main points of that article. And so just to give you an example, there was one that he assigned by Williamson who was talking about the Washington Consensus like 15 years after he had written his original article. And he was explaining how he felt the term Washington Census had been corrupted from what he originally meant. And so I would probably write a sentence or two on that as like my big takeaway on that article, as far as the Washington Consensus evolved in his own mind, but he also feels that it's abused to describe certain things it was never intended to describe. So that would be an example of how I would kind of guide my personal summary of that article. Any other questions about the exam?
Well, I don't think we can remember.
I think when I took the exam, I didn't have multiple choice questions. I just had IDs and essays, and the long problem was a solo growth model problem for me on the midterm. I think I can't remember for sure, I think the essay was on poverty and inequality. I would not make that assumption for you guys because he covered it later in the cycle than it was covered with my professor. So I can't say for sure what that would be. As far as IDs, you know, I just kind of flipped through and understanding the role of the IMF versus the World Bank, understanding macroeconomic stability versus structural reform. Understanding those distinctions was something that jumped out, and to me as an example is the kind of thing that I can foresee him asking as an ID question. I don't know that that will be one, but you know, that I think is relatively, it's the kind of thing that you can describe in 1 or 2 sentences. All right. Anything else?
You said IMF versus World Bank. What was the other contrast you did?
Well, that was tied in. It's macroeconomic stability. That's kind of more tied into the role of the IMF, and structural redesign, which is more the World Bank's function.
Gotcha.
All right. Yes.
For the multiple choice, do you think, are those, and you might not know the answer to this, but would they largely be conceptual, or do you think as well the multiple choice would require more mathematical equations, coming up with an answer?
I would guess that most of them will be conceptual.
Okay.
But one, you know, as I was flipping through the pages, one that I thought would be a possible multiple choice question is just the sources of growth analysis, which was off of that formula G equals WL times L, or no, I'm sorry, the growth rate of L plus WK times the growth rate of K plus A, where he would give you these variables, but not the equation, and say, okay, here are 4 answers, you know, which of these choices is the correct answer for the growth rate of this economy, using source of growth analysis, all right? So that might be an example of a multiple choice question that would involve a formula, but if I had to guess, most of them will be conceptual,
Okay.
right? Another possibility would be he could give you the total number of people who are below the poverty line in the total population and ask you the head count index. You know, that one's a little straightforward. I don't think that that would be a question because you would just divide one number by the other, but it's a possibility. Basically, much more simple math-based questions might feed into the multiple choice, my guess. Yeah. Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, and then my second question was, are the exam is going to cover the material that we covered up to today's class, and through today's class, rather?
Yes,
okay.
Correct. So I think it's chapters 1 through 6 of Perkins, and then I'm just swagging that I seem to recall from the syllabus. And then there are some chapters from Easterly, but you know, expect the concepts to be driven out of Perkins and the illustration to be drawn out of the other readings. You know, so citations for an essay type question. Yes.
Did you say that lecture notes will be posted by then?
I haven't heard that. I don't think any lecture notes will be posted.
What was the question?
Will any lecture notes be posted? All right. The lecture videos will be. I sent out an email today saying I put them all on the Hopkins share drive. I tried to post them on YouTube myself, but individual users don't have the authority to post files as large as the ones we have. So Hopkins has an account. The IT official today said he would do it tomorrow morning. I've put them all in the share drive. I'll do the 2 from today because these classes get split into 2 files. I'll do those tonight, and so everything should be on there tomorrow. You know, he'll send out the links to me, I'll pass them out to the class.
Okay. But the very first sessions, they're already on the blackboard because I couldn't find them. The videos.
Yeah, the first 2 are, and I'll send out those links if they weren't already provided. So the first 2 classes are already on YouTube, and so it'll be the 4 classes from last week and this week.
But not on the blackboard, right? Because the
Not on
professor
Blackboard,
mentioned that
it'll
they're on the
just
blackboard. I see.
Yeah, it'll be straight on YouTube. Yes.
I have a question now that you've touched the growth rate analysis. Since we've turned in our homework, is there any way you could give us the explanation of how the last problem works?
Yeah, let me go through some of this information, and then Professor Shania gave me a copy of the answer key, so I'll pull that out and go through that. All right. Okay, the things that I'm going to try and cover right now are the 2 sector models that were covered in the last class, and a couple of the math intense, you know, relatively speaking, not the concept stuff, but the more graphical math-oriented information for today. So I think the takeaway from the two sector models that were covered last week, and that's the labor surplus model and the neoclassical model, is that they lead to different conclusions about how growth will occur and what its impact is on the economy as it grows. So I'm going to draw some of the key graphs from each and try and compare them to show how they're different. Alright, what I've just drawn are the graphs for the labor surplus model. And okay. If you recall from just the basic solo model, you've got a production function that starts to level off because you've got diminishing marginal returns. What we've got here in the labor surplus is a model where not only does it start to level out, it actually totally levels out. And that's very significant because in the neoclassical model, it never totally levels out. That's why I tried to draw this little arrow just kind of indicating it's still going up at smaller and smaller rates, but it never totally levels out. And the idea is that in this model, you have basically maxed out agricultural production. No matter how many more workers you add, you're not going to generate any more agricultural production. And the theory was that, you know, if you look at, I think that the model was developed in England, there was only so much arable land. So adding people to the agricultural industry didn't really increase production. So what you had was, I'm going to try and refine this a bit, was when you talk about the marginal product of labor, when you talk about the basic solo model, it's highest initially, and it gets lower and lower as you go along. Now, what they did, and you can see this in the book, I think it's about page 130 or something, they switched the axes here so that this end is actually where you have all the workers, and this end is you're moving towards zero. So this gets basically totally topped off, let's say right there is 0 workers. So they've switched the way this is set up. So at 1,000 workers, where you've basically got 0 marginal return on your labor, this marginal product of labor is basically level until you start bleeding significant number of laborers away from the agricultural industry. In this case, the second sector, because this is a 2-sector model, one sector is agriculture, the other is industry. And so the reason that these models are looking at this is you're speculating that when you develop the industrial sector, your capacity to